The challenge for me, talking with you, Jack, is I feel like you still haven't taken Trump seriously enough.
This is a special edition of the Diet Soap podcast. With me today is author Jack Ross, author of The Strange Death of American Exceptionalism, and, of course, author Chris Cutrone, author of The Death of the Millennial Left and Marxism and Politics, The Last Marxist, Total Genius, all of that. And I'm Douglas Lain, podcast host of Diet Soap and author of Batch Revolution, which is a novel. And today we're going to be talking about the election, which actually is sort of a return to talking about Jack Ross's book, because his book is about the realignment in American politics. And it was written before a lot of the things that are now defining this race cemented. For instance, it wasn't clear even if Trump was going to be the nominee when you wrote the book, Jack. But yeah, we're going to take this opportunity to touch it base with Jack and Chris both around the election. Jack, you sent me an essay by Freddie DeBoer about how the Democrats' reliance on the memification of Harris indicated that they weren't trying to win the presidency, but were trying to make Kamala Harris the president of Twitter or the president of the internet or something like that.
I mean, there's no class character necessarily to running on vibes, or however one would have put it in the parlance of past generations. Obviously, as you both saw firsthand and know so much better than I, any kind of protests outside the DNC were a complete dud. So you cannot make the comparison to 68. But I remember, well, I'm obviously not old enough to remember Hubert Humphrey and the way he talked about the politics of joy or whatever the exact speech was. But like back when C-SPAN would run all of the party conventions through history or the nomination speeches, and I would watch those. I remember watching Humphrey and just the completely manic speech that he gave while all hell was happening outside.
So I call you forth. I call forth that basic goodness that is there. I call you to risk the hard path of greatness. And I say to America, put aside recrimination and dissension. Turn away from violence and hatred. Believe. Believe in what America can do, and believe in what America can be. And with the help of that vast, unfrightened, dedicated, faithful majority of Americans, I say to this great convention tonight and to this great nation of ours, I am ready to lead our country.
From the nation's capital and or public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
This is for Hillary.
So, you'll hang just a little bit?
Like a small boat on the ocean, sending big waves into motion.
Like how a single word can make a heart open.
I might only have one match, but I can make an explosion. And all those things I didn't say, wrecking balls inside my brain. I will scream and loud tonight. Can you hear my voice this time? This is our fight song. Take back.
I've still got a lot of fight left in me.
Losing friends and I'm chasing sleep. Everybody's worried about me.
Let me start by thanking my most incredible husband, Doug.
Forgive me, Doug, if this is going a bit far afield, but I've actually been thinking a lot more lately about we've talked about how much was about 2016 was very specific or contingent on the Clinton machine and trying to very tightly engineer, but not knowing what they were creating as far as awakening. You really did have the beginnings of, as soon as the Clinton Hollywood marriage began, and as a means of raising money, and I mean the early stages of that symbiosis, and as a specific condition of our unique post-Cold War American decadence about how Hollywood became political in the sense that it's been beginning in the 90s.
To bring up something from the book, from your book, the impossibility of a supermajority like Nixon and Reagan won in 72 and in 84. And also, when you bring up Hubert Humphrey, actually what occurs to me is more McGovern, the McGovern Convention in 72, that set a certain tone in the Democratic Party. And there's a documentary film that I always recommend people watch, One Bright Shining Moment, that's about nostalgia for McGovern. It's worth watching because I think of the Clintons as McGovernites.
Oh, well, that's all true, and that wasn't why I brought up the Humphrey speech in 68. I mean, before RFK Jr. dropped out, I talked about, is that going to be a negative landslide, as happened with Nixon and Wallace in 68, that sets up in 72.
Michael Cohen, let's look at the electoral vote totals from 1968, and Richard Nixon getting 301 electoral votes compared to 191 for then Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Governor George Wallace obtaining 46. The popular vote was closer. Why did Richard Nixon win?
Why did Nixon win? That's a good question. I would say a couple of factors. I mean, I think primarily the sense of dysfunction in the country. I think a desire for Americans to, this is to quote a phrase used in the 1920 election, a return to normalcy. 68 is it's hard to sort of understand it now, but how just dysfunctional the country was, how divided it was, the sense that the country was coming apart at the seams. You not only had the riots after the King assassination, you had both assassinations, you had the violence in Chicago, but you had 500,000 troops fighting a war in Vietnam that a good portion of the country opposed. So I think that was a big factor for Nixon. I think also for another important factor was Humphrey's inability to distance himself from Johnson. I think if he'd done so, he might have actually pulled the race out. You just read the electoral numbers, but I have the numbers in my book, but a couple tens of thousands of votes in different states switch sides, and Humphrey wins. It was I think another week, and Humphrey probably pulls the nomination out, pulls the election out. It was that close. And I think, one thing to remember about Nixon is that he started the race with about 43% of the vote in the polling. That's what he ended up with. He didn't really bring more people behind him. Nixon was not a popular figure. One thing someone asked earlier how Bobby Kennedy felt about Nixon. I will just tell you that in my research in the book that the one thing that was consistent about every political figure I looked at, Republicans, Democrats, is none of them liked Richard Nixon. They all just didn't trust him, they didn't like him, they didn't respect him, and I think that was a view held by a lot of Americans. And I think it speaks to how weak a candidate he was, that in a year in which Republicans should have I think won by a larger margin, he barely did Humphrey. And of course, there's also the Wallace factor too, which I think certainly helped, certainly hurt Nixon's totals to some extent, and probably would have been a larger margin had Wallace not been in the race.
As for impossibility of a supermajority, Trump certainly is not capable of it and never has been.
That's why I was going to raise the prospect. It would be very ironical. I don't think it will be likely to happen, but it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if Trump got the popular vote but lost the Electoral College?
I was going to ask about Nate Silver, and apparently he has Trump back on the other side on the other side of 50%, and but the polls have not quite caught up to that yet. I mean, to the extent I'm thinking about it, I am dreading the rising probabilities of not the phoniness that led to January 6th, but a real disputed election. Why, if 2016 was the turning point, as I argue, that 68 started 24 instead of 36-year cycle with 92 in 2016, why then we didn't have such large majorities? And I thought back to 1896, which was where it began, that McKinley never got an especially large margin over Bryan, but then when Roosevelt succeeded McKinley, and well, how stable or unstable supermajority that was is complicated. That it's easy to forget there was only one. I mean, Roosevelt won that one election in 1904 by supermajority style margin, and he never won another election again. And yet, even with Wilson coming in when he did, you had stable supermajority margins before the New Deal.
I want to jump in here. So there's this.
Yeah.
This is 1984 Reagan against Mondale, and he won everything except for Minnesota.
Mondale's own state.
So 1984 reflects the reality of the Reagan Democrat, right? And some sort of change in the electorate so that there was enough of a common culture and common political vision that people from the coasts to the flyover country voted for Reagan.
The Democrats still had Congress, though.
I guess my question is, how should we understand these kinds of results where there seems to be a real political consensus in the country, and to what extent is that, even when it happens, illusory? And I guess the flip side of that would be, to what extent is the division that seems to be appearing now illusory? I mean, what are we really getting? What kind of understanding can we have about the political will of the public from these kinds of results?
Yeah, what do elections tell us at all? Right. Well, I mean, I think that so the reason I pointed out that the Democrats retained Congress under Reagan is that part of the electioneering is the idea of coattails. So the story with the removal of Biden was that he was hurting the chances of congressional Democrats. That's part of the story anyway. And and I feel like, well, but in fact people do split their vote. They do vote for one party's president and another party's.
Inside. Foreclose that Tristan Law. At Bold 3 Detergent Plus Fabric.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
And I realize now this is very relevant to our discussion about J.D. Vance. Okay, some of this seems a little crackpot, but just the overarching idea of recentering politics around families with kids, but I mean, certainly seemed entirely plausible. I mean, I think, well, you brought up a question about that, Doug, about Reagan and how reactionary was he really? And I think they're very different in the content, but it's the same kind of contradiction that I think Reagan and Vance have. Reagan, it was a contradiction which was certainly very common for that place and time, between, if we don't want to say pro-white exactly, pro-backlash politics, and just fundamentally unconservative, optimistic worldview, and the latter certainly won out in his actual presidency. And I think it's the same story with J.D. Vance, that he has this very personal, bitter critique of a lot of the new class value system that he entered adulthood around.
I want to say something about Vance and how I first came to know of him. And I'm going to maybe speak to some confusion that I had around Vance early on that might be revelatory. The first person I knew who mentioned J.D. Vance was Angela Nagel, who had written Kill All Normies. And when I looked into him, I think, and I wish I could remember the other author's name, but I think I confused him with someone else.
The people who are advocating for the poor the most often don't understand them on a visceral level.
Hi, Chris. I'm delighted that you're here today to talk to us about your work traveling the United States and documenting what some people have called forgotten communities.
3 years ago, I took the show on the road, as it were, and just got in my car, my Honda Odyssey with 292,000 miles on it, and started driving around America. And I went to places like Hunts Point, which is a neighborhood where people tell you not to go. So when I went to places, I would kind of just say, on Twitter actually, I would say, hey, I'm in Michigan, where should I go? And people would say, you should go here, but whatever you do, don't go there. And where they say, don't go, that's where I went. And I just spent 2-3 years doing that. I put, of those 292,000 miles, 192,000 of them came from those trips. So I put about 190,000 miles on my car just driving around America, visiting places, neighborhoods, towns, communities that we kind of all know about, but we say don't go there. Places that people call left behind, forgotten. And I didn't go there and go to nonprofits or talk to the mayors or talk to politicians or community leaders. I just went and hung out. I hung out in cheap motels. I hung out in McDonald's a lot, community colleges, churches, and before I stopped drinking, I hung out in bars, and just talked to people and just try to learn from them and listen and talk about their viewpoint and what they saw and how they felt.
Since I started podcasting, there was this critique of neoliberalism and of elite liberal politics that was coming out of the rural parts of America, but that was distinctly left-wing. And I had been introduced to a number of people who had these kinds of critiques. Some of them wrote books by a fellow podcaster named KMO. So when I first started podcasting, I was like reaching out to people who are interested in psychedelics, people who are interested in subsistence farming in their backyard in reaction to the 2008 crisis, who were against the big regulatory apparatus that got in their way as small-time entrepreneurs, but who all thought of themselves as being either libertarian or left-wing. None of them were Bush Republicans, right? None of them wanted to go back to the Bush era. And at that time, there was no Trump. There was no hint of populism within the Republican Party.
I was going to say, this is the populism thing, right? Mm-hmm.
And so there was this sort of populist left that was a mixed bag that I was interacting with in the early days of Diet Soap, the podcast. And
the dirtbag left.
Yeah, well, before even then, but yes, the white trash left is who I was talking to sometimes. And I had my earliest listeners would, encourage me with my backyard chickens. And one of them invented a backyard chicken feeder.
Encourage you? You have backyard chickens?
I had backyard chickens.
No way.
Can we back up a little here? When you
Go
say,
ahead.
Wait. Let me get to my point.
Yeah.
before it gets into my personal life too much. In my listen, I'm in Portland. It was mandatory, but the point is, it was a law. There was a law. But the point is this that when I first heard about Vance, I took him to be pretty much in line with all of that. He was critiquing the elite liberal left, not just the woke left, but the left that would ignore the plight of white working class people, and that couldn't be trusted to represent working class people at all. And I also took him to be advocating for the white working class from a perspective that was more critical than elite liberals were allowed to take when it came to the urban working class or black people. That because of that, it was more, because they were white, he could be more critical of their culture, but also to speak to the class basis of the
There's a white working class in the cities too. So at Hampshire College, which is in Massachusetts. So I'm from New York, but I remember it was like springtime and I just gotten a haircut and I was wearing like slightly different clothes than usual, wearing like t-shirt and shorts. And one of my actual professors, not one of the professors I was very close to, but she kind of recoiled when she saw me come out of the stairway. And she sort of jumped. She's a little Jewish woman. And I was like, oh, what's wrong? And she said, I thought you were like a Southie. It's like a South Boston, like Irish kid who was going to beat her up. And this is in Hampshire College, which is in Western Massachusetts. I'm like, there's no one from South Boston's making it all the way out here to beat you up. Right? But I suddenly looked myself. I looked like a working class kid, like a white ethnic urban working class kid, just by virtue of dressing a little differently and getting a haircut, and that always struck me, right? So there's that. I mean, in terms of the Vance thing, part of his story is being alienated from the academic milieu he entered into as a scholarship kid, and I think, even his connection to his wife, right, who's South Asian, who's Indian American, I kind of feel like, well, yes, right? Like, even though like academia is woke, actually maybe children of immigrants are also not entirely feeling at home culturally in woke academia or PC academia either, right? That they could bond on that level, exactly on that level, as like parvenus, as like new to this scene, especially at an Ivy League school or at Yale, right? And so, it does sort of bring us around to this question of like, who do the Democrats really represent? Meaning, on the one hand, the Democrats represent urban ethnics. They always have, going back to the 1800s. On the other hand, they've also represented a kind of WASP elite too. And, it's not like the WASP elite has gone away. It might have culturally changed. I'm thinking of Bayard Rustin, since we brought up the 68 and the 72 elections. Bayard Rustin, in 1970, the year that I was born, warned, and regretted that the Democrats were going to become the party of rich whites and poor blacks. And that has happened. And that has happened not just recently. Right? And that's what the evangelical, the evangelicals as a constituency for the New Deal Democrat electoral coalition, they were the non-rich white people. That's what that represented. As opposed to the Southern Bourbons.
But from my perspective, because Vance had come up so close to being in the milieu I was in, because I think he was interviewed by some of the podcasters in those days that were at least adjacent to what I was doing or I was aware of, or I might have had on at times. He was a never Trumper. He didn't code like right wing or even Republican to me at first, and he did seem aligned with the kind of populist left that I was aware of in the early days. But I think I confused him with some other people who were writing similar books. But for me, Vance represents the reason why people who are Bernie bros might be so disdainful of Vance is because Vance represents the realization.
Yeah, they feel
politics.
the affinity. They feel the
Okay,
affinity.
so this is where I want to pick up. But first, Doug, explain when you describe Angela Nagel populist or self-conscious populist left of early Trump years. I mean, did the term dirtbag originally refer to people other than the Chapos, or did it become? I mean, because I remember when I first learned about the Chapos, I guess it was the New Yorker profile at was it right after the 2016 election? Then, as I gradually or not so gradually realized, okay, these people have all the worst obnoxious anti-conservative critiques. This is nothing but affect. They have their actual politics, or I mean, they basically ended up being the excuse for Vox to upgrade DSA 2.0 when it came out for not being sufficiently pro-identity politics.
I think the post-left, and the dirtbag left were the post-left became something else, but there was a sense that if you were critical of the Democratic Party, you might be called post-left. And so like Cornel West and Chapo and Angela Nagel and a bunch of people got called that after Trump was elected.
Okay, and there were people more sympathetic than the Chapos who, at that time, who have become completely tanky as well.
Yeah, and the dirtbag label was something that they invented to sort of try to capture this thing that was going to be class-based rather than identity-based, that wouldn't be as aligned with elite universities, and that would try to be able to speak to some of the concerns that Vance might have been raising. But it was not where it started. It was just one expression of this broader thing.
What is the dirtbag left, and sort of how did that sort of phrase come about?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Nice to meet all of you. I remember looking at this on the notes you sent me, and I was like, oh, I have no idea when I first said that. But it actually was a tweet. I can't remember my exact wording of, but it was used to describe the podcast Chapo Trap House that I'm on before I was on it, when I was a fan, and it was just my roommates. And I was trying to articulate a kind of a political tendency of people for whom class was the primary political category, and thus had become sort of disgusted with the supplanting of material politics with this sort of vague, repressive, liberal etiquette that's intended to sort of signify your values. And I think it very much sort of, it's a little wallowing. It's a little, I'm disgusting, fuck you. It's a little bit of that. At the time also, we were all really, really broke and lived in a legally sublet 2-bedroom that we had 3 people living in. And it had like black mold and leaks and was falling apart. So the idea of being sort of condescended to by people for having like a sense of humor or, just speaking a pretty common conventional language that wouldn't offend the average person on the street, it was really insulting. It was just like, what are you doing? And I think also we really resented the conflation of etiquette with like kindness or compassion, things that like we do believe in, and being nice to people and generally fair and genial or whatever to people more broadly. That's not the same thing as, this kind of etiquette enforced at the point of a gun, because without which you're going to be completely excluded from the political discussion because you're not serious. Yeah, so it sort of kicked off as a joke, and then it just sort of took off, and people sort of they're like, oh, yeah, that's what it is. Like, I have these politics, and I'm not going to confuse what I believe politically or even morally with sort of middle-class values.
So
we have to be careful not to reverse the significance of things, I think. Meaning, I think there was a crossover Bernie vote for Trump in 2016. There definitely was. And it wasn't like white guys only. It was definitely people of color, women of color included. I mean, I met these people in Chicago. You know, there was Latinos, blacks. There were pro-Bernie people who were like, if it's not going to be Bernie, it's going to be Trump. And I think that when the Democrats like attack like media figures for being too soft on Trump, what they're doing is they're attacking like, well, you can't give that any legitimacy whatsoever. And it's convenient for them to say, oh, well, the only people who might have voted for Bernie who would then vote for Trump would be straight white guys. But that's just not sociologically accurate.
I guess I could bring up a key point about just election math and why I just never took seriously or never expected any of the talk of why didn't Trump become his more statesman-like self and after the shooting in the convention and whatever. No, and I mean, as I went through the motions of holding out hope longer than most for post-Trump right, and I just realized, just looking at the map and looking at what I laid out in just the final stages of editing this book, of just the game of inches. Trump had 46% with the key Rust Belt voters in 2016, and then in 2020 he got that up to 47% with his first big non-white breakthroughs, and then basically the 48, 49, and I guess we're going to see the RFK Jr. vote on top of that now. It was basically the what in a word you call the Joe Rogan constituency that Trump simply could not close the deal with in 2020, but it was clear fairly early on they absolutely will not vote for Biden again.
It's going to be another referendum on the pandemic because it's going to be a vote against the Democrats' COVID policies post-Trump, I would say. I would also say that it's going to be another anti-war election, in fact. So the Bernie to Trump voters who I met, blacks and Latinos, men and women, younger people, they were definitely anti-war. Some were veterans, but yes, some were veterans, but some were not, and still imbibed the same atmosphere of it. Well, it's not just vibes. It's a sense that the Democrats represent a complacent foreign policy establishment that's liable to get the U.S. into wars. Well, so when they poll people about Israel-Palestine, and they show that higher than ever, people in the United States are critical of Israeli policy, I don't think that prevents Trump from getting the votes of such people.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
Can I say something that came to mind when you talk about the pro-Palestinian movement in the United States, barring the majority of people who are maybe rank and file, marching around, making it happen, I think it's a mistake to think of the pro-Palestinian movement as a peace movement.
Oh,
it is. It is a pro-war movement,
right?
And it is pro Hamas. And I know that's going to inflame a lot of people for me to say, but I think just it is. And the aim of the left.
Surely we saw that on the streets.
Yeah,
the aim of the Milwaukee and Chicago, we saw that directly.
The aim here is to destroy Israel, and the left would like to see that, and because they believe wrongly that would cripple the United States and break American hegemony and bring down the global empire, and the Death Star would explode, and then when it comes to Ukraine, they there is not much of a left peace movement around Ukraine, and so Trump can step forward and say, I'm going to give Israel enough strength to end this conflict so we can build something new and create peace in the region. And I'm going to end this regime change war in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians are being used by the United States to try to
bring down Russia,
bring down Putin and bring down Russia and break it into pieces. And in that way, he can stand up as a peace candidate, even if it is in the old Reagan style of peace through strength. Absolutely. I don't think that I would agree with the Ukrainian policy. I'm not sure about whether or not I'm very skeptical of his ability to resolve the situation in Israel and Palestine. But that is how I think your average Trump supporter who's ex-military would think about Trump as a peace candidate.
This isn't a point about Trump. It's just a point about where America is in the world. I mean, and that ascribes too much agency or expectation on America. I mean, my line, just taking stock at the very beginning of the Biden administration, was American foreign policy as a lumbering dinosaur. And the question about Vance, and we've talked about historical analogies, whether it's to Reagan or to Roosevelt, and I certainly, having written as much as I have about the Socialist Party, don't want to have a rose-colored view of Roosevelt. I think he may have been a native of this very city of Cincinnati I'm in right now, E.W. Scripps, namesake of the news service, who said in 1912, one day he will ride a white mule up Pennsylvania Avenue and abolish Congress. I'm not sure I'd put that past J.D. Vance. I mean, in your email questions, and I was a bit shocked the way you framed it in terms of if we want to see a future socialist party, or a lot depends on what a Vance presidency being set up would look like.
Yeah, I mean, in the background of this conversation, that something we haven't made as clear as I would want to is we are kind of discussing the potential for a Vance presidency creating more of a consensus in the United States and creating conditions of enough peace. I think that might be something that we kind of floated in this conversation unconsciously, for conditions of relative freedom to maybe reemerge. That this is the idea. It's very counterintuitive for most people on the left, but that eventual Vance presidency might be unifying in some way. That he has a potential to unify the country.
Because the Democrats have depicted him as polarizing.
Yes, the Democrats have definitely.
They have to do that.
Well, I mean, this is something I want to kind of kick around a little bit, because on the one hand, yes, the Democrats have to do that. But on the other hand, when class issues get taken up by either party, they do tend to be transformed into cultural issues. When you talk about the history of this, like in '92, Pat Buchanan's speech at the Republican convention was one that did level the charge of at the Democrats, that they were cultural warriors, but he did so in defense, as someone who's trying to defend a culture as well, and defending the family, defending the idea of America as a great country, defending Reaganism. All this was sort of wrapped up together in his speech.
And then in Nicaragua, that squalid Marxist regime was forced to hold free elections by Ronald Reagan's Contra Army, and the communists were thrown out of power. Fellow Americans, we ought to remember it was under our party that the Berlin Wall came down and Europe was reunited. It was under our party that the Soviet Empire collapsed and the captive nations broke free. You know, it is said that every American president will be remembered in history with but a single sentence. George Washington was the father of his country. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and saved the Union. And Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. And it is time. And it is just about time, that my old colleagues, the columnists and commentators looking down on us tonight from their skyboxes and anchor booths, gave Ronald Reagan the full credit he deserves for leading America to victory in the Cold War.
Well, the prospect of Clinton and the Democrats coming back in '92 was different from Jimmy Carter, or even different from Mondale and Dukakis.
This is exactly why I asked about, with your mature memories that I don't have of the '80s.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.